be with you. Friends, it's great to see you here this evening. My name is Casey Thompson. I'm the pastor of this congregation, but it's good to be with you tonight. This is Wayne Presbyterian Church's 150th year of being in existence, of witnessing to the glory of God and seeking to enjoy God. We're happy that you're here. As we gather tonight, one of the things that we will be doing this year is a number of different speakers throughout the year, and tonight is our first. Our speaker this evening is Shane Claybourne. I think a lot of you know him already, but Shane has worked with Mother Teresa in Calcutta. He helped found the Simple Way in Philadelphia, and he speaks throughout the country on a number of different topics. But it is a real pleasure to have you here tonight. I discovered while we were sitting and talking that he and I are both rather serious jugglers, so I'm pretty excited about that. But there will be none of that tonight. But Shane speaks regularly, probably 100 times a year, at a variety of different places because he has a unique and compelling voice. So it's good to have him with us this evening. And I'll also just say that not only has he worked with our good friend Tony Campolo on a number of projects, things like the Red Letter Christians, what if we took the words of Jesus seriously, but also he is a graduate of our favorite university, or our second favorite university, because always ours is probably the first Eastern University just up the street here. Friends, join me in welcoming Shane this evening.
I'll have to say your enthusiasm when he said 150 years was pretty low. That's a huge accomplishment, so happy 150 years, Wayne Pres. It's beautiful to celebrate that. I'm honored to be one of the voices that will be speaking. And I heard that the next season of Wayne Pres is around this idea that this is to be a school of love. A school of love, right? And every church probably should be a school of love. But it's great to be here tonight and to be with Tony and Peggy and my wife somewhere. She likes hiding. She's out there. But I've been proud to call Philadelphia home for about 25 years. I grew up down in East Tennessee, fell in love with Jesus there, came up to Philadelphia to go to college. I went to Eastern, and then while I was in school, I had friends that started taking me to spend time with folks living on the street. And it was in the middle of that I feel like my Christianity kind of went from doctrinal statements to to really come to life. And I really started to realize, we're talking tonight about grace, which incidentally is one of my favorite things to talk about. And I began to realize that being a Christian is not just about having new ideas, but having new eyes, right? That we begin to see people differently. We begin to see the world differently. And one of the first memories of that was when we moved into North Philadelphia. I live in Kensington, just off of Kensington and Allegheny. And so a lot of our struggles are very much kind of in your face. We see the funk, we see the beauty, it's all kind of out there. And when we started our community in 1998, we always had an open door to folks living on the street. We've always shared a lot of food with folks. And so at the time that we moved in and the first year or so, we were feeding about 100 people every day. So almost every day we would walk to the store to get, supplies that we needed. And in order to walk to the store, we had to go down Kensington Avenue, where we would encounter a lot of folks that were really struggling, and right down that block are a lot of women that are abused and trafficked. And so as we were going to the store one day, one of the women on the avenue asked me, she kind of propositioned me, and as an East Tennessee kid, I kind of just felt awkward, and we went on to the store, we got our food, and beeline back to the house. And when we get back to the house, we're unloading everything, getting ready to make 100 meals, and one of the bags of bread that I had gotten had a tear in the side, and the bread was all kind of crusty and stale, and we look at it, and my friend goes, well, that's all right, I got the receipt, we'll just go back and we'll get it, exchange it for a new loaf. And I'm like, awesome, that means we have to walk back, and so we go back down the avenue, and we exchange a loaf of bread, no problem, but on the way back, we see that woman who had talked to me before, and at this point, she's down in the alleyway, hunkered down, and she's shivering in the cold. And my friend Michelle and I, we knew that we couldn't just pass by her, right? So we went down in the alley, and we knelt down, and we started talking to her, and she just had tears rolling down her face, and we said, listen, if you need a safe place to come back to, we live around the corner, we've got a little community there, you can get warm, there's a lot of folks that care about you there. If you're hungry, we got some good bread and good food, so she jumped up, she followed us back to the house, and as soon as she gets into our building, she just loses it, and she starts weeping, like wailing almost at the top of her lungs, and my friend Michelle's just rocking her in her arms, and as she sort of gathers herself, she looks up and she says the strangest thing. She goes, "You guys are Christians, aren't you?" We're like, whoa, check my T-shirt, I'm looking around, and we said, yeah, we love Jesus. How'd you know? And she said, I know because I can see it in your eyes. I can feel it, And she said, I used to be so in love with Jesus that I used to shine like the stars in the sky. I had this fire in my bones, she said. And she said, but this is a cold, dark world. And she said, it feels like it's almost killed the good in me. It suffocated the light in my soul. And so we began to, pray with her, and we prayed, that prayer that we all need to hear, that we are beloved and beautiful. We prayed that she would feel that fire begin to burn in her soul again. And she left. And weeks passed, and we didn't know if we'd ever see her again. And then one night, there was a knock at the door. It was pretty late, but we get a lot of knocks at the door, so I just kind of opened the door, and this woman jumps in the house. She's like, hey! And I'm like, wow, do we know each other? Let's start there, And she said, yeah! And she starts talking 100 miles an hour. She's like, I just wanted to tell you that I'm on fire again. She said, I can feel the love of Jesus again. She said, I wanted to tell you that I'm shining like those stars again. I knew who she was when she said that, right? And she said, I wanted to come back and just say thank you for reaching out when I was really at the bottom. And she said, I wanted to give you a little gift. And you could almost see her apologetically say, I don't have much to give, though I lost pretty much everything when I was living on the avenue. And she said, but I smoked a whole lot of cigarettes. And I always collected the Marlboro miles from the sides of the cigarette boxes because you could trade them in for stuff, right? So she goes, hold on. She goes out to the car that she had come in, and she brings back this shoebox that's just boiling over with Marlboro miles, right? And she goes, they're all yours. And I'm thinking to myself, my mom's going to love this, when I come home with a Marlboro sweatshirt or something. But she gives me this box of Marlboro miles, and honestly, I think it's one of the most precious gifts that I've ever been given. I held on to them, and in fact, I come to find out later, they make really good page markers for your Bible. And that's what I use them for. And every time I open up my Bible and I see my Marlboro mile, I'm reminded that we have a God that is loving people back to life again, right? A God that is loving a world back to life again. And I think of this idea of grace and mercy, and I think that it's heavy on my heart because we live in a world where there's a lot of disgrace, right? There's a lot of unlove that happens in the church and in the world. And so as I think of the fundamentals of our faith, I think this idea that we have a God that so loved the world that Jesus came not to condemn the world but to save it is a beautiful message of good news for the world, right? But we often miss it. In fact, I was telling one of my friends that story that I just told you, and he's one of those guys that really likes arguing theology. You know those people, right? If you don't know those people, you probably are those people. But he's always wanting to argue theology, and he says, well, the thing about Jesus is he never talked to a prostitute. I'm like, hold on, man. I get my Bible out. I'm ready to throw down a little bit. And he goes, no, listen. Jesus never talked to a prostitute because he didn't see a prostitute. He just saw a child that he was madly in love with. I told my friend, okay, you win, but only this one time. But this whole Christian thing is about having new eyes, isn't it? That we can see that, as our brother Brian Stevenson, graduate of Eastern, dear friend, he says, we're all more than the worst thing that we've ever done. That we're more than the deepest funk that we have found ourselves in. And you look at the scriptures, and the whole story is a story of grace. It's a story of redemption, right? And I like how Bono, the great theologian, singer of U2, right? He says, the fact that the Bible is full of messed up people used to disturb me, but now I find it a great source of comfort. Because we see that there's a God that can save anybody. If you look at the scripture, you see Moses, who was a murderer, right? It's part of why I've been so involved with the death penalty. Is like Moses was a murderer. David, who I learned in Sunday school in East Tennessee, was a man after God's own heart. You're like, on good days, But David had some terrible days, and in fact, in 2 chapters of the Bible, David breaks pretty much every one of the 10 Commandments. He just shreds right through them, He ends up committing adultery, or I think it's more appropriate to call it rape, right? Because it says he looked at Bathsheba, sent his men to get her, and took her, right? And so he rapes Bathsheba, and then he ends up, having her husband, Uriah, murdered in the battlefield to cover up what he had done. Sometimes you get the sense that kings feel like they can get away with anything. Anyway, I'll stop there. But like David, he's just on this trajectory of sin, right? And by the way, when David did that, he already had 7 wives and 10 concubines. The brother had a problem, right? He was a womanizer, and yet he hears the rebuke of God. He repents as he listens to his friend Nathan. He goes on to write so many of the Psalms, and I love that David's a part of this story. In fact, it's very interesting if you read the first chapter of the New Testament, Matthew chapter 1, is it goes through the family tree that leads to Jesus, right? And, those can be a little boring sometimes. You're tempted to just skip over them because he goes, this was the son of, this was the son of the son of the son of the son. It goes through the family tree. But if you look carefully, it's really interesting because it gets to the David and Bathsheba thing, right? And it says, and then Solomon was born. But Solomon was the son of David, but his mother was Uriah's wife. It's like, don't forget, that was messed up, right? It reminds us that whole thing that went on there was messed up, and yet the genealogy that leads to Jesus is that rape, that murder, all of that. God is working through the cracks, and it's a reminder that God's grace is bigger than David's sin, right? That this is not about how good we are, but how good God is, even in the midst of our brokenness. So this idea of grace, that's why I love Saul of Tarsus too, who by every definition was a religious extremist, right? Went door to door trying to kill Christians and oversaw the brutal stoning and murder of the execution of Stephen, the first martyr of the church. And then you keep reading, and he gets blinded by the love and grace of God. You know, he has this radical conversion, goes from Saul to Paul, and he goes on to write things like, "Chief of sinners am I," because he had done some stuff. And that's why I really believe that if we have a hard time believing that murderers are beyond redemption, we can just rip out half the Bible, because it was written by them, right? If we, the whole Bible would be a lot shorter without grace. This is a love story, right? And that's why I constantly go back to this idea that I think one of the most fundamental things about our faith is this idea that we are all beloved and we are all broken. And you get the sense of that. You know, that's part of the message all through the Scripture, is that God is faithful even in the midst of our funk. And so one of my favorite stories, you know, is the story where the woman is caught in adultery. I mean, the story starts terribly, you know, but this woman is drug out in the middle of the town and humiliated. And all the men are getting ready to kill her. And arguably, they had every legal right to do so. I mean, it was a death-worthy crime. It was a capital crime. And yet, as the men are getting ready to stone this woman, Jesus enters into the circle of armed men, and he bends down in the dirt, and he writes something. It's kind of interesting as you read it, because we don't know what he wrote. You know, theologians speculate that maybe he was writing, "Where is the man?" Takes two to tango, right? And maybe he's writing the names of the women that all these men had slept with. Who knows? You know, one of my favorite answers, we asked some of the kids, "What do you think Jesus wrote in the dirt?" And one of the kids said, "Maybe Jesus wrote, 'If this doesn't work, run, woman.'" Because what he does next, you know, we don't know he wrote in the dirt, but what he does next is he tells all of these men, "Let the one who is without sin cast the first stone." And of course, he'll remind them and all of us, if you've looked at someone with lust in your eyes, you've committed adultery in your heart, right? If you've called someone a fool, you've already committed murder. And you see these men, you know, with their stones begin to drop them, and they walk away. And the story ends with Jesus and the woman, and Jesus says to her, "Where'd they all go?" And the message is crystal clear, isn't it? That the only one who had any right to throw a stone had no desire. That the closer we are to God, the less that we should want to throw stones at other people. And as they sort of walk away, you get the sense that part of the very core of the Christian gospel is that no one is above reproach and no one is beyond redemption. That message that rings the truth. And it's why, you know, now as I look at the state of the church, I'm very grieved because we've so narrowly defined what it means to be pro-life, you know, to the issue of abortion. I grew up down south, and everybody's talking about being pro-life, and I believe abortion matters. I want to reduce and eradicate abortion, but I began to see that there are a lot of people that call themselves pro-life, but they might be better off saying they're pro-birth, right? Because it's like life begins at conception and ends at birth, you know, and you end up being pro-life on abortion, but anti-life on everything else. And so many Christians that say they're pro-life, they're pro-guns, pro-death penalty, pro-war, right? And that's part of what I long for is a movement in the church that has a consistent ethic of life that says every single person is made in the image of God, and anything that squashes a human being's life or dignity is hurting the image of God in the world, and God takes that personally, right? So as I started looking at the issues of life, one of the things that troubled me is that when it comes to guns, the highest gun-owning demographic in America is Christians. In fact, we own guns. Christians own guns at a higher rate than the general population. And I know this. I mean, I'm from Tennessee, right? We got country music that says, "This house is protected by the good Lord and a gun. And if you come uninvited, you'll meet them both, son." I mean, that's our world. And yet we think of the guns in our country. We've got more guns than people. in my lifetime, we've lost more lives to guns in America domestically than in all of the wars of American history. And we think of these guns, and they've almost become a form of idolatry, haven't they? Where we attribute this kind of godlike power to our guns. And in the U.S., we have about 5% of the world's population, but we have half the world's guns. We've got 5 times more gun dealers than McDonald's restaurants. I mean, that's something, right? We were talking to some of the kids in our neighborhood. One of the kids said, why do we have so many gun shops in Philly when there aren't that many deer? It's a good question, right? In the U.S., we manufacture guns at the rate of 9.5 million guns a year, 18 guns a minute, over 1,000 guns an hour, 1 gun every 3 seconds. So I began to look at that, and these are not just issues, but they're for folks that care about life. It's 100 lives a day that have been lost to guns, right? So we, in Kensington, this becomes personal, right? When it really caught hold of my heart was when we had a 19-year-old named Papito who was shot, and I can remember hearing the gunshots ring out, and I ran outside, and he had fallen on the front steps of my house, and right in front of our front steps, and he was still alive, so I grabbed Papito's hand, and I started praying for him. He's gasping for breath, and the ambulance comes, and they drive him off, and he was still alive, he was still moving, fighting for his breath, and we found out the next morning he died. And it was after Papito died that I remember thinking about the words of Martin Luther King, where he said, we're all called to be the Good Samaritan and lift our neighbor out of the ditch on the road to Jericho. But after you lift so many people out of the ditch, you start to say, maybe we need to rethink the whole road to Jericho. Right? We've got to do something about why people keep landing in the ditch to begin with. And so it sparked something in us. We began to organize. We joined movements like maybe many of you are a part of, Heeding God's Call, and the movements against gun violence, Moms Demand Action, and others that are here in Philadelphia, Ceasefire. But one of the most powerful services we ever had was right after Papito died. It was this same season of Lent, right before Easter. And so we decided, let's do things differently. Let's take our services into the streets. And so we had our Good Friday service the Friday before Easter as we remember Jesus' death on the cross. We had it in front of the gun shop 2 blocks from our house, the shooter shop, one of the most notorious gun shops in America for guns that are sold there then used in violent crime. So the young men in our neighborhood carried the cross in front of the gun shop. And there were hundreds of us there. We read the familiar gospel story of Jesus' death on the cross and the women weeping at the foot of the cross. And then after the gospel reading, we invited the moms who had lost their children to gun violence to share their stories, and one shared after another. And there was something mystical, really transcendent that happened, where it was like the tears of the mothers 2,000 years ago met the tears of our moms, and the suffering of Jesus met the suffering of our street corners. And I'll never forget this woman afterwards, after the service, she came up and she's just emotional, and she said, I get it. I said, what? She said, God knows what it feels like to lose your son. It was Papito's mom. And what she said is one of the most powerful articulations of the gospel I've ever heard, right? That God knows what it feels like to lose your son. God knows what it feels like to be humiliated, stripped naked, and executed on display. Like that, God knows what it feels like to be born a brown-skinned baby in Palestine, in a refugee in the middle of a genocide, right? God knows what it feels like to be us. And that struggle, around gun violence continues, but we also, as some of you know, we got really excited, not just about protesting what's wrong, but protestifying how things can be made right again, right? So one of the images that we love is the image of the prophets Isaiah and Micah that foretell of a world where God's people will beat swords into plows and spears into pruning hooks, right? Where we'll transform the tools of death into tools of life. So we thought, man, let's do it, like that. We don't have a lot of swords in the U.S., but we got more guns than people, so 320 million guns. Let's get some. So we started inviting people to donate guns, and I have an entire basement full of guns that are chopped up now, right? So we've had like hundreds of guns donated, and Katie and I are both blacksmiths now on the side. We're learning the art of blacksmithing, and we have a network of blacksmiths around the country that are turning guns into garden tools. So I brought you a few to look at. This is one of our shovels that's made out of the barrel of a gun, and actually the wood stock is made out of a gun there too, so I'm going to pass that around. You can hold on to it. And this is another plow that we use in our garden, and this is a special one because this gun we found in an abandoned house in North Philadelphia, and we took it and we began to transform it, but we decided to invite those same moms and dads that had lost their kids. And I'll never forget, as we heated up the metal. This is the barrel of that handgun. And this one mother with a picture of her son on her jacket, she began to beat on that red hot metal. And as she was beating on it, she began to weep. And with every thump of the hammer, she said, "This is for my boy." And this is what we made that day. It was also when I realized that what we're doing with transforming the metal is not just symbolic, but it's sacramental, right? That we're actually beginning to create a liturgy of life that gives space to honor the victims of gun violence in our country. So we just traveled all over the country, 40 different cities all over the U.S. with the Forge, and we've been melting guns down every night, hearing the stories of the survivors of gun violence and folks that have been shot in war, and even in the middle of, we did one with Sharon Risher, whose mother was killed in Emmanuel AME Church in South Carolina, as she shared about what it's like to lose your immediate family members in an act of such hatred, and yet what's going to heal the wounds isn't more violence. It's not the death penalty. What's going to heal the wounds is the love and grace of Jesus that we're talking about tonight, right? So we think of even one of the other stories is as we traveled around, this one young man, he counted 18 times. 1, 2, 3. And then he retreated afterwards, and he was really shaken up. And we talked to him afterwards. We said, "Listen, you want to pray or talk together?" He said, "Yeah, I do." He said, "I counted 18 because I killed an 18-year-old. And so he said, this is healing my heart tonight." And so as we think of those who on all sides of gun violence have created wounds, who have endured wounds, I'll pass that around. You can pray for our streets, right? For this country that is so infected with violence, a violence that goes all the way back to our founding, right? To the violence that it's the blood that was shed in this land from Native Americans, from the backs of enslaved people, that what is going to heal the wounds of that violence? Like, what does grace look like in America? We think even of outside of the guns, and as we think of the epidemic of violence that's manifest in our military. We have $20,000 a second that we spend on the military. We have bombs that are 80 times bigger than the Hiroshima bomb. We've got the capacity of over 50,000 Hiroshimas. Just boggles the mind, right? What does it mean to be the peacemakers, as Jesus said, in this country that we live in, where out of the some 15,000 nuclear bombs in the world, there's 2 countries that own almost all of those, and we're one of those. We own over 6,000 bombs. So what does it look like to live in a country that even just in 2016 dropped 26,000 bombs in 1 year. In 2016, 3 bombs an hour. I can remember, after September 11th, we had all kinds of things happened in our country, didn't they? Where folks began to realize how fragile life is. We saw the attack at September 11th and over 3,000 lives tragically lost in that act of hatred, terrorism. And yet I think people have been still reeling, for the last 20 years trying to figure out what that means, And after September 11th, I remember, you may remember this, someone dropped a banner from City Hall that said, "Let's kill them all and let God sort them out." From City Hall in Philadelphia. And so there were those ugly expressions of fear, fragility, anger. But there was another group of folks that we got to know that were the immediate family members of victims of 9/11. You may have heard of them. They're called September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows. So they lost their husbands, their wives, their children, their spouses, their immediate family members in 9/11. And they, as they watched the response of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, they were devastated. And their prayer became, "Our grief is not a cry for war. Please don't kill in the name of our loved ones." And they became a force against the war. They went to Iraq and Afghanistan on delegations of the victims' family members of 9/11, and they brought back gifts and stories, redemptive stories. And so I got a call, eventually from a friend that said, "How much do you believe in the cross?" I said, "A lot." They said, are you willing to join a delegation and go to Iraq? Are we willing to risk our lives believing that in the cross as much as people have believed in the sword? Do we believe in loving our enemies, enough that we're willing to risk our lives for it? And so they said, "We're going to go to Iraq, and we want you to think about going on a delegation." And so that's one of those things you're like, "I probably need to pray about this and talk to my mother," And so we did. And as strongly as I've ever felt, I think in my life, I felt this confirmation that was the right thing to do, was to go on this delegation with some 100 other, many of them were pastors and doctors and nurses. We had veterans, all kinds of folks that we went together to Iraq to be a presence of peace and reconciliation, to try to stand against the bombing and the war. We also were volunteering in the hospitals and visiting families. But we ended up being in Baghdad in March of 2003, which was during the shock and awe bombing, the bombing of Baghdad, which was about 900 bombs a day at one point were falling on Baghdad. And so we lived there and saw some of the most horrific things I've ever seen in my life, things I wish I could unsee, right? But we also saw the miracle of grace and of love in the midst of some of the deepest violence I've ever seen. And it just was kind of manifest everywhere that we went. One of my most powerful memories of being in Baghdad was when there was a gathering of Christians who we gathered to pray for peace, just as the bombs started to fall. And it was a building not too unlike this one. It was about this size. There were hundreds of folks that were packed inside. In fact, they couldn't even get in. Many of them were in the streets holding candles in solidarity. But we were inside of that building. We began to worship Jesus in there. And one of the pastors, the bishops, he actually pointed to the cross and he said, "This cross makes no sense to the wisdom of the world or the smarts of smart bombs, but it's this cross that teaches us a different way, the narrow way that leads to life. It's the cross that teaches us how to live in a world of violence without mirroring the violence, that we are able to look in the face even of those who would want to hurt us and say, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. And he said, this cross is the centerpiece of our faith. And then the whole place erupted in singing Amazing Grace in Arabic, right? And I'm listening to my brothers and sisters singing Amazing Grace in Arabic, and the tears start to flow, and I got kind of worked up. I got a little of the Pentecostal thing inside me, and so I got all shook up. And I came up to the altar afterwards, and I grabbed that bishop, and I'm hyped up, right? And I said, Bishop, this is one of the most powerful worship services I've ever experienced. I said, I feel God in this place. And then I said something ignorant. I said, I had no idea that there were this many Christians in Baghdad. And he goes, yes, son, this is where it started. And he said, you didn't invent Christianity in America. You just domesticated it. And he said, he pointed out the window and he goes, that's the Tigris River and the Euphrates. Have you heard of them? The Garden of Eden's right down the street, he said, right? He said, you go back and you tell the church that we are praying for them to remember who they are. So those words, they echo in my soul. And then as we left Baghdad, we had one of the most powerful experiences of grace that I've ever had in my life. As we were leaving Baghdad, we drove this desert road from Baghdad to Amman, Jordan. And as we're driving through the desert, we hit something in our car that popped the tire, and it flipped our car over. Some thought it was part of a cluster bomb. We're not sure what it was, but what happened was our car went off the road and it flipped over, and we were all injured in that. A couple of my friends were injured pretty badly, and the car was sitting on its side. And so we managed to get everybody, we pull everybody out the window, which wasn't easy, and then we're sitting on the side of the road. The bombs are still falling around us. Cars are on fire, and there's no one in sight. And one of my friends had a pretty bad head injury, so we're praying for him. We're holding, something on his wound, and we have no idea what we're going to do. We're sitting on the side of the road in the middle of the desert, and we see this car start coming down the road, and it gets, closer and closer, and then it stops, the first car that passes, and these Iraqi guys jump out of the car, and they take us into their car, and they rescue us, and they take us into a little town called Arutba in the Anbar province, and they drive us to the hospital in this little bitty town. And when we get to the hospital, the doctors come out of the hospital, and they're shaking their hands in the air, and they're going, why are these bombs falling? And then they name everything that's been bombed in their town. The last thing they said is one of the bombs just fell on the hospital. It hit the children's ward. And they said, so the whole hospital is closed now. And of course, they see our hearts kind of sink in distress, and they said, but then he looks up and he says, but don't worry, we will still take care of you. We just wanted to explain that we can't do it in the hospital. The hospital's closed, but we're setting up a clinic. And they set up a clinic with a bed for each one of us. The whole townspeople began to bring us gifts, right? The doctors saved my friend's life as he had just gone into shock, and I'm so moved by all this. I'm starting to think, like, how can we thank them? And my American mind, sadly, I'll just confess, went towards money, right? So I think, what can we give them? So I gather all the money from the 10 of us, and I get it in this big pile of Iraqi dinar, and I go to give it to the head of the hospital, and I said, we just want to say thank you. And the doctor goes, if you just want to say thank you, then say it. He goes, you can keep your money. He says, we want you to know that we love you. And when we saw you, we didn't just see Americans. We saw our own flesh and blood. And we hope that if you found us on the side of the road in America, you would do the same thing for us. And they said, all you can do to repay us is tell the story. So we've been telling that story for 10 years, And in fact, my friends down in Durham, North Carolina, they started their community named after the grace and hospitality of Rutba. It's called Rutba House in North Carolina. And so it's always been our dream to go back. And not too long ago, a few years ago, we got to go back. We go back, we travel that same desert road back to Iraq. It's not real easy to travel to Iraq right now, but we go back and we manage to get through all the hoops, and we get into the town of Rupa. They had found the doctors that saved our lives, right? And they gathered all of us, and we retold the story. We reunited with these folks, and then they said, everybody came, right? There were all these sheikhs and religious leaders and imams, and there were the mayor. Everybody came, and they said, you got to understand, we don't get a lot of visitors, so this is exciting, right? And then one of the guys goes, now, there are a few people that would want to kill you, but not many of them. And they said, so we'll take care of you. They slept by our beds with AK-47s, and we're like, this doesn't fit into my theology, but I'm so grateful for your generous hospitality. And then afterwards they said, we're going to go meet with the mayor. So they take us to meet the mayor. This is one of the other miracles. It's just like one thing after another happened. We meet with the mayor, and the mayor goes, this is the stuff that heals the world. He said, this is what we need more of, is relationships where we know one another. And he said, we don't need more bombs and armies and war. He said, we need to heal the wounds of this violence and hatred that are everywhere. And the mayor said, we need a sister city that we can keep building a relationship with. And I'm like, Philadelphia, it means a city of love. And I said, how about Philadelphia? And the mayor goes, no. He goes, Philadelphia is too big. It's a big, big city. He said, we're just a little town, 30,000 people or so. He said, we need a little town in the United States to be our sister city. And then he talks to his friend and gets a translation. He says, I've only been to one little town in America. It's in North Carolina. It's called Durham. And I'm like, come on, right? I get chill bumps. I'm like, we have a community in Durham, North Carolina called Rupa House, named after the love of your town. And he goes, then it's done. And then the mayor says, so we will start a community in Rupa, and we'll call it Durham House. And it will be committed to the same love and grace and healing of the violence in our world. And so those relationships, I'm convinced that part of what we need right now is courage. Right? We need the courage to stand for love and grace in the midst of a world where those are endangered, right? Where it can feel like the hatred is winning over the love, and yet, everywhere I go, I think I see this light shining in the darkness, or as our brother Stanley Hauerwas likes to say, he says, Christians are meant to be like air fresheners in the bathroom, right? We're meant to leave off the smell of Jesus. We're meant to leave off the smell of love amidst the hatred. So if we believe that light shines in darkness, what an amazing time it is to be alive right now, right? So the last, story of grace that I'll share with you is, as we've been thinking on working on the death penalty, and one of the things that breaks my heart is that just as with the guns and militarism, the death penalty has survived in America, not in spite of Christians, but because of us, right? Wherever Christians are most concentrated is where the death penalty has continued to hang on. It breaks my heart, right? That the Bible Belt is the death belt in America. 86% of executions are happening in the Bible Belt. And so we've begun to work on this. My home state of Tennessee just brought the electric chair back. In fact, they used it this past week to kill someone. And so in Tennessee, I've had a unique opportunity where I've been able to go into Riverbend and get to know a lot of the men who are facing execution. Katie's been with me, my mom's been with me, and we get to hang out for 2 or 3 hours sometimes with these men, many of whom are facing execution. And some of them maintain their innocence, and I believe that some of them are innocent. Others of them, they're very transparent about what they did, and the pain, the horror that they were responsible for. And yet, at the very heart of all of it is this idea, are we better than the worst thing we've done? Are we, do we believe in redemption? And one of the things that happened last year was one of the guys I had gotten close to was executed. It was one of the first people, it was the first person I had known well, been meeting with for years, who was executed. And some 30 years ago, he did a terrible, terrible act of killing his wife. And I have no idea exactly why all that happened. The more I looked at his life, I saw how hurt he had been for so much of his life and transferred that hurt into this terrible crime. And yet he also began to try to heal the wounds of that. He fell in love with Jesus, and after decades, he began to get to know his daughter, who, he was responsible for killing her mom, and they began to build a relationship together, and she saw some of the changes that the Spirit had done in his life. And then, the time came for his execution. And I was with him about 3 days before he was executed, and I said to him, Don, what's going on inside your soul? And he said, well, I'm too blessed to be stressed. I've tasted the goodness of God. He said, no matter whether this is the last week of my life or whether I've got a bunch of more years, I want to praise Jesus with everything in my soul. And he said, no matter what happens, the words of worship will be the last words that I say. And so then just, things continued to roll out. This, the execution, just such this like liturgy of death, right? Where he's put in quarantine, he's given his last meal, and Don, for his last meal, he said, I'm allotted $19, but I would rather fast and have the $19 go to the homeless mission in Nashville. And he dedicated his last meal, the money he was given to the homeless. And then as he was taken into his execution, he said, for his final words, he said, I'd like to ask for forgiveness from all the people that I've hurt. And I've hurt a lot of people. And then Don said, and I'd like to extend forgiveness to the people who are getting ready to take my life. Those were his last words. And then he said, but Warden, if you don't mind, I'd like to go out singing a worship song to Jesus. And the warden said, sure. And so as they executed Don, he sang the song, soon and very soon, I'm going to see the King. There's no more dying there. There's no more crying there. I'm going to see the King. Those were his last words, worship to Jesus as he had promised. And yet I think, here in the midst of all of that, so much is at stake, right? That as we see someone executed in the heart of East Tennessee by a Christian governor who runs for office saying that he talks to Jesus every day, and yet he this week put 1,400 volts of electricity into a man's body, we think like some of what's at stake right now in the world is the integrity of our faith. Because on so many of these issues of grace, we've looked more like the darkness than the light. And yet these guys, they teach me so much about it. One of the other guys that's facing execution in Tennessee right now, his name is Abu Ali. And his execution right now is scheduled for Maundy Thursday, right before Easter. And he fell in love with Jesus, and he's an incredible singer. So as we prepare for the dialogue, there's a microphone here. We're going to talk in just a second. But I wanted to play you my friend Abu singing that song, Amazing Grace. And as you listen to it, may we remember how sweet grace is, right? And we remember our brothers and sisters in Iraq that are singing this song in Arabic, our brothers and sisters on death row that have tasted of grace. And so this is Abu.
The sound
You can sing along if you want to. How about that? So it's a really great honor to be able to kick off this 150-year celebration with Wayne Pres. And as you think about what it means to be a school of love, I am so excited to get to be a part of that, whether it means partnering with what we're doing in Kensington, trying to love folks back to life, trying to love a neighborhood back to life, or whether it means challenging the systems and structures of death in our world, and the work that Tony and I and so many others have been doing at Red Letter Christians is really all about just wanting a church that looks like Jesus again, right? Wanting a church that's known for love again, known for that amazing grace that we sing so well about, but sometimes we have a hard time living out. So let's keep dreaming and scheming about how we can be a school of love together, and how we can partner with Red Letter Christians and Wayne Pres and the simple way of Wayne Pres. So thank you so much for listening to me. We're going to open it up for dialogue. Thanks so much.
Indeed, thank you very much. Realize I just said thank you, and now I'm going to ask people to give you money, which is something you talked about. But one of the things that we were going to do with each of the presentations over the 150th year is to do a simple love offering that can be used for the simple way in whatever way that you see fit. So we're going to do that. We're going to pass those. And I realize this is a surprise offering for some of you. And I realize this is like the third time for some of you that I've asked money for today. But I know you have some left. So I encourage you to be generous. So as we're doing that, though, let's not waste additional time. So if you have questions, want to be part of this dialogue, come to this microphone and go ahead and ask them. And I'll get out of the way so you can do that.
Hey, while you do that too, while you're getting up to the microphone, I brought these cards too, because the guys, including Abu Ali that we just heard, they've my friends in Tennessee that are on death row, they've asked the governor to come and pray with them. And they wrote this very simple letter signed by, this is over half the men on Tennessee's death row that have asked Governor Bill Lee to come pray with them. So we've had folks all around the country writing a little message of grace and love to the governor, inviting, reinforcing these guys' requests. So I'll pass these around. You can only do this if you want to, no pressure. But we've literally had thousands of these postcards coming into the governor, and we're hoping that it really moves his heart. So we'll pass them around. And you can bring them back to me up here or at the table outside, and we'll put postage on them and mail them, okay? So I'll pass them around on both sides. You can take a few if you want. We've got plenty, but we're flooding the governor's office, asking him to stop the executions and meet with the men.
I'm going to go ahead and ask because that's how we are. First of all, I'll say that Shane will be out in the connector after this is done, signing books, selling books. He loves to talk to people, so come out and talk to him. I know there are a few people in this congregation here who want to know if they're going to write a check.
invite you to do is to write your checks to Red Letter Christians, because yeah.
Sorry.
No. I think we'll figure all that out. The way that I think of it is the 2 feet that I walk on are the Simple Way and Red Letter Christians. The Simple Way is our local work in North Philly, and the Red Letter Christians is our movement work, really trying to change the narrative of what Christians care about in America. So they go together. And if there's something that gets you excited locally, we can find that support. And some of you, I think right now, Red Letter Christians, it feels like we are poised for such a time as this to really challenge the narrative of what Christians care about in our country. So there's someone in this room that just gave $10,000 to Red Letter Christians, and we're so grateful for that. That's the kind of support that we really need going forward, especially this year. So thanks.
I'll go ahead and ask the first question. Give you a little more time. Sometimes Christians will talk about a second conversion, and you sort of described it earlier, that moment where you move from doctrine or belief to living it in a more visceral way. And I was just wondering if you could tell us more about how that happened for you.
Yeah, I feel like I've had a whole bunch of conversion times, I like that scripture that says we work out our salvation with fear and trembling, right? It's not just a moment, but a movement, and I can realize a number of really monumental conversion times that I've had. In fact, sometimes I joke that, every year in Tennessee, we go to a youth retreat and get born again, or as Tony says, we come to the altar singing just as we are and leave just as we were and keep living just like we always had, But there really came a time where I began to ask, well, what does it look like not just to worship Jesus, but to follow Jesus? What does it look like for Jesus to reshape my priorities and even my lifestyle, how I hold my money, how I think about welcoming the stranger, and those sorts of things. And that really happened for me in 1995 while I was at Eastern. A group of homeless families were living in an abandoned church in North Philadelphia, and they were being evicted. And that was, as some of y'all know, that was sort of the spark that lit the fire for us. And we heard about them being evicted, and these are mostly moms and children there were 3,000 families on the waiting list for housing. And so we went from Eastern down to North Philadelphia and found that cathedral, and on the front of it, these families had hung a banner that said, "How can we worship a homeless man on Sunday and ignore one on Monday?" And I feel like that was one of those moments where I realized that not just that Jesus cared about the poor, but Jesus came and joined the poor. Jesus came and left all the comfort of heaven to join the struggle here on earth, and that we're called to sort of follow after that example. And Tony and so many other people have preached that so well. That I heard one preacher say, if we find ourselves climbing the ladder of upward mobility, we better be careful, or else on our way up, we'll pass Jesus on his way down. So that, those moments have really shaped me, and certainly being with Mother Teresa in India, was another time that I really felt like I began to understand what it looks like to live out our faith, and not just see our faith as a set of doctrines, but really as something that transforms our whole life. Come on up, y'all are quiet. Yeah.
Would you give a little more guidance on what it would be good to write?
Yeah, cool. So on these postcards, sure, Peggy asked for me to give a little bit more guidance on this. Well, and just the backdrop of this was, we've been asking these guys, what do you think will move the governor's heart? And they said, we believe, proximity makes all the difference. So if the governor would just come and hear what Jesus has done in our lives, that's what we're asking. And so that they're asking that the governor, they're not even really asking the governor to stop executing as much as they're saying, just come pray with us and talk with us. So we're inviting you, to write a little line just encouraging the governor to visit the men on death row. It might be something as simple as when Matthew 25, when I was in prison, you visited me. It might just be like, these men are very sincere in their request, asking you to visit. Please, do that. So does that help, Peggy? Yeah. So just a line or two, and we'll send them to the governor's office. Other folks, I guess you can wave your hand like that, and I can repeat it, or you can come up here if this is too intimidating.
You can tell the group what Red Letter Christians means.
Yeah, okay. Tony doesn't hold back on the Red Letter Christian plug. But no, but it's we believe in this because Red Letter Christians, the idea came about when our friend Jim Wallace was being interviewed, actually in Tennessee, my home state. He was being interviewed by, get this, a secular Jewish country music DJ. That's a lot, right? But so this guy that was interviewing him on the radio didn't really seem to have a whole lot to do with Christianity, but he said, I've read a lot of the Bible, and there's parts of it that I love. There's also parts of it that I kind of find troubling or confusing. But the DJ said, I've always liked the stuff in red. I was talking about, some of the Bibles that have the words of Jesus highlighted in red. And he said, I love the red stuff. And you guys seem to like the red stuff. You should call yourselves Red Letter Christians. And that kind of stuck, And so for a lot of us, we love the whole Bible. But the fact is that Jesus is the lens through which we understand and interpret the Bible, and the lens through which we understand and interpret the world that we live in. And so a part of what we're grieved by is the fact that many Christians don't always look like Jesus or act like Jesus. And so, when Gandhi was asked about Christianity, he said, I love Jesus. I just wish the Christians acted more like him. And that's what we want. We want a church that loves like Jesus, that acts like Jesus in the world. And that's what you all are after at Wayne Pres. So Wayne Pres has got to be an honorary Red Letter church, So, but you can go on our website. You can see a little pledge that we made together of what that looks like to be, committed to bringing the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. And there's a whole bunch of leaders around the country that are all operating under this movement and umbrella of Red Letter Christians. In fact, I was just in the UK with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, and he's very proud to call himself a Red Letter Christian. So I gave him a shirt like the one we got out there that says, "What if Jesus meant the stuff he said?" Justin liked that. He said, "I got one for the Pope too, so I'm going to deliver that one soon enough to Francis." But no, it's great. So, and because we're right here in the area, please let's keep dreaming of what it looks like to live out Jesus' love in Philadelphia area and Pennsylvania. The death penalty, we're really trying to close the door on it. We've got a governor-imposed moratorium right now. Pennsylvania has the death penalty, but we're not executing someone. But the governor has basically said we need to close the door on this because if he leaves, another governor could come in and restart executions, which is exactly what happened in Tennessee. We went 10 years without executions and then got a governor in that really has ramped it up. So, yeah.
Can't get to a mic. Could you just tell us a little bit more about what the Simple Way is currently?
Yeah, sure.
You started, but tell us what it's like.
Yeah, absolutely. So our sister was asking about the Simple Way. We started the Simple Way coming out of college at Eastern, and a bunch of my friends pulled our money together. We ended up buying a little row house. We were inspired by the early church in the book of Acts, where it says everyone shared everything they had, no one claimed their possessions as their own, and really this idea that the gospel is lived out of living rooms and dinner tables, and that we need to live in proximity to those who are hurting. So we made our home in Kensington, and then we outgrew that one house. And if you're familiar with the Catholic worker movement, Dorothy Day and others, it looks a lot like that. So we were doing hospitality. We found an abandoned house, which we got for $1. We can get houses for $1 in Kensington, just so you know. We fixed it up, and then we have grown into more of a village now. So there's a bunch of us that live in the same few blocks. We've got community gardens and murals that we're painting, and we share food with a lot of neighbors. We have kind of neighborhood celebrations that happen through the year. So we have open houses pretty much every month if y'all want to come down and visit sometime. And we're also we've always been committed to challenging the things that are squashing people as well. Like, so the idea that we're fighting against principalities and powers, and we're asking, like, what do those look like in our neighborhoods? So the inequities in the school system, you know, the pipeline to prison, the mass incarceration, all those are a part of our sort of DNA from the beginning, you know. And so on our front door it says, Dear God, heal all that is broken in our hearts, in our streets, and in our world. So we really believe that God is redeeming individuals, and God is also healing our neighborhoods and our world. That kind of the personal and social salvation are all kind of intertwined at the heart of the gospel. So, yeah, that's kind of what we're up to these days. And we're doing like affordable housing too. We take abandoned houses, and we have another nonprofit called Simple Homes. So we sell houses for $35,000 at zero interest on the mortgage. We take an abandoned house, fix it up, we finance that, and then we customize the monthly house payment based on each family's income. So if any of that gets you excited, we have, you know, a number of folks that really believe in one part of what we're doing and want to get involved. So we're pumped, you know, to have new friends and partners. And Tony and Peggy helped finance one of our first homes, you know, that we did, and we've done. We're doing more and more of those, so we can still get the abandoned houses for pretty cheap, and then we fix them up and sell them for $35,000. Yeah.
I was going to share with you that we showed your video to our 6th and 7th grade students at Sunday school this morning. And this is a group of kids that are never quiet. And they were just so engaged and very excited about the work we did. And that you had dreadlocks. So,
Yeah.
so I have to explain to them that you don't have dreadlocks anymore, but I think they would be very interested. So anything you can do, I think that the kids would be very much interested in.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll keep brainstorming that. If you couldn't hear, she was sharing about some of the young people that they watched a video clip or something this morning we're sharing about. So we'll keep brainstorming things that we can do, kind of cross-pollinating our young people maybe here and you know, where we are. But we're, yeah, and I cut my hair because I found that I can get away with more if I look really sophisticated. No, I'm just kidding. When I went to Afghanistan, they told me I had to cut my hair, and so I you know, blended in a little bit more. So and then my wife offered to give me a massage every week that I kept pretty hair, and so I'm still milking that. So thanks for that. Yeah, brother.
Do you have any stories about the use or abuse of solitary confinement in the prisons? There is a campaign getting started by the churches in Pennsylvania to have a law reforming and regulating the use and limiting the use of solitary confinement in prisons.
Yeah, thanks.
That's down in the weeds, but
Yeah, absolutely. So our brother was asking about solitary confinement. I mean, I think there's so many different facets of prison reform, and even how we want to think of what is going to heal people from the kind of violence of our society, right? And so certainly challenging solitary confinement and excessive punishment are a part of that. Because I can hardly even imagine what it does to someone to sit in that kind of a hole, you know, and without sunlight, and many people without any human contact, right? So I mean, one of the most horrific stories that I heard was a mother, and this was in Texas, where the first time she was able to touch her son was after he had died. She was not allowed contact visits, like, literally couldn't touch her own son for decades as he was in prison. And so I think, like, what does that do to us? And I think we need to think, especially as people of Jesus, right, where the biblical idea of justice and righteousness are bound up together. And my scholarly friends tell me the best translation that we have for that phrase is restorative justice, What does restorative justice look like? And that's what the penitentiaries were named after, right? The Quaker, like the penitentiaries, some of the oldest ones right here in Philadelphia, where we built these buildings that were actually modeled after monasteries and had cells, the same name that monks and nuns call their spaces, right? That penitentiary was to share the same root as repentance, to rethink how we think and live, right? And yet what we have now created is really, really dark, right? Like this idea that we are locking people into cages for some for the rest of their lives, many people who their entire adult life, or many of them they're from even a young age, are locked in cells and cages, what that does to us. And I kind of carry this with me just to make it personal, is this one of the guys that was released after 30 years, he sent me this and he says, Shane, just as I started to write your letter, I was moved off death row after 30 years. And he said, I just walked on grass for the first time in 30 years. God is so good. But I hold that with me to remind me of the urgency of what this is doing to people that are made in the image of God, to like literally go 30 years without feeling the feel of grass on the bottom of their feet, or some of them seeing sunshine. So it's a great question. There's certainly folks that are working full time on trying to end, a supermax and solitary confinement. So we need to be a part of that. I think we need to be on the forefront of that, just as we are on the death penalty. So thank you. Other folks, yeah, a couple more. Yeah, come on up.
Utilize the mic here.
Yeah.
Where do I start? Obviously, I can talk to you personally afterwards for my own sake, but I guess for anybody else who's curious, where do you start? I've been a Christian pretty much most of my life, but it's hard sometimes feeling like an inactive Christian, like an armchair warrior, and not much of a front lines kind of guy. So how does someone like me who works, 1 or 2 jobs, do just a fraction of what someone like you does?
Well, thanks for asking the question. And I think we're all on that journey to try to be a little bit more faithful, to do something beyond living just, the day-to-day, and to live a little bit more missionally right in the world. And so I like how Frederick Buechner, wonderful Presbyterian writer, right, that he said, we've got to take our deepest passions and connect them to the world's deepest pain. It's my paraphrase a little bit, but we got to take our passions and connect them to the world's pain. And then when we do that, not only are we doing things that give us life, but what we're doing gives life to other people. And so the big question then becomes not just, am I going to be a doctor or teacher or lawyer, but what kind of doctor or teacher or lawyer am I going to be, and how do we connect our skills and passions to in a way that alleviates the suffering of other people. So we've had all kinds of folks that are using their gifts in ways that are liberating to other folks. We've got artists that are painting murals. We had a plumber that moved in and was like, give me a list of everybody in the neighborhood who needs some plumbing help. I've been a plumber my whole life. He's like, I'll live with y'all for a month. We're like, might need you more than a month, But I think all of us can do that, and some of us have resources that can fuel the movement and fuel redemptive work. So there's sort of a web of subversive friends that I think we need to continue to build together to say, how can we support each other in the kingdom work. But this is the other thing I'd say is that sometimes our biggest problem is not a compassion problem, but a proximity problem. It's not that we don't care about the poor, it's that we don't really know them, because everything in our world is kind of moving us away from the suffering and the pain, and out of neighborhoods where there's people that don't look like us, and things like that. So I think we've got to challenge those patterns, and we've got to get in relationship. And the way that we do that is by going where people are already doing it. I didn't just go knock on the door of Riverbend Maximum Security Prison. I went with friends that have been going for years, and they introduced me to those relationships. And the same in Philadelphia. We've got a powerful movement of the new sanctuary movement around immigration. We've got all kinds of good stuff happening. So I think we just got to, some of it's just about that ambition to start, you know. I think it's the old saying's true, that the hardest part about running a marathon is not getting to the finish line, but getting to the starting line. You know, it's really kind of those first few steps. But that's where community becomes really important, is because we can kind of nudge each other to begin doing that. It's harder to maintain that momentum on our own. So keep at it. But yeah, Mother Teresa, she had a great line. She said, "It may be very fashionable to talk about the poor, but not as fashionable to talk to them." You know, and if we really care about immigrants, then they have names and faces. Like, these are not just issues. You know, gun violence is not just an issue. Gun violence has names and faces of children of God that are the casualties of it. So I think what creates the fire in our bones is that proximity, right? Like, the more distant we are, the easier it is, I think, to kind of lose a sense of urgency around these things that are affecting so many people's lives. So thanks for your question. I don't pretend to have it all figured out either. I think we're all sort of learning from each other, but we're hopefully pushing each other to you know, keep diving in, not becoming numb. Yeah, back there.
Thank you very much for your stories.
Yeah.
It reminds me of what one of our former pastors 30, 40 years ago said about a true religious experience. You feel the presence of God, you're changed by the experience, and you got to talk about it. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the Bible. But it doesn't sound like you have very much spare time, but we thank you for your invitation to go up to North Philadelphia. Sometime we'd like to invite you down to Southwest Philadelphia, which is the focus of our existence here, our missional existence for the last 31 years.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm grateful for City Lights and so many of the other fruits of that have flowed out of Wayne Pres. So thank you. Yeah. Anybody else before we close up? Yeah. I see a few more hands. We'll try to get to them. And then,
Yeah, could you give some advice? Obviously, you deal a lot with homeless people, so you walk by a homeless person, maybe they have a handout. The thought is, well, I would like to give them something, but I'm worried it might go to drugs or alcohol. You know, I've gone to the point of buying them food, and then I got kind of accosted by 20 people who wanted food. It was scary. My brother-in-law works with homeless people in California. He's got a box full of nutrition bars. That works great. But not everybody has a box of nutrition bars, and not everybody's, you know, it can be scary. What advice can you give to people when you see homeless people?
Yeah.
How do you react?
Okay, great. In case you couldn't hear, I'm trying to repeat them just so you can hear. You know, how to interact with folks that may be on the street that we pass. And I mean, I think we have to start by saying these are some of the trickiest relationships because they're some of the most unnatural, you know, when you're just meeting someone for a brief second. And so we're always trying to figure out, or like, how can we go a little bit deeper, you know, with that. So it's hard to do, like, love in a drive-by way, you know, but I think that there are some creative ideas. You gave one, which is, you know, we do travel in our car with, like, really healthy granola bars or like socks or gloves in the winter, and so when we're, you know, passing by someone, we can say, hey, you know, here's something that hopefully is useful for you, you know, to you. But then we can also, I think, take some risks and get a little deeper in each other's lives and go out to eat together if we can, or you know, make a dinner that we can invite people into. If someone's needing money for transportation, maybe we can give them a ride, you know. I mean, those are all things that we're encountered with all the time. And we rarely find ourselves giving out money, but we're trying to, you know, go a little bit deeper into those relationships. And but I'll never forget one sign where the guy said, you can just say no, it's better than nothing at all. And he was basically saying, at least recognize that I'm looking you in the eyes, and it can be so degrading and dehumanizing to, you know, have people not even look at you and things like that. So I still wrestle with these commands. Jesus said, give to everyone who asks. Geez, you know, I mean, that's a pretty daunting like commandment, give to everyone who asks. And I've come to really interpret that like we can give ourselves, our presence, we can give love to everyone who asks. And so I think we need to be folks that, encounter people and recognize them and try to give what we can. I also think like we should take risks more. Like we should err on the side of grace rather than the side of suspicion. And I don't really see Jesus looking at us and going like, oh, you gave too much money to heroin addicts, you should have been a little stingier, but actually like that person that said they needed diapers for their kid, they actually really did need diapers for their kid, and we could have given it, so like, what do we have to lose on some of that, and isn't it interesting that we're sometimes suspicious of poor people, but we're not as suspicious of rich people, and like they might spend the money on alcohol or drugs or prostitutes, and you're like, look at all these millionaires, what they're doing, but anyway, like I'm just saying, like maybe we don't need to be so biased, not that you are, but I think we often have this bias to poor folks that we have this sort of like, a blank check to rich folks, but so I think let's take a few more risks and let's realize that what's important is not how much we give, but how much love we put into giving it, as Mother Teresa said. So I think sometimes giving money can be a cop out. You just write someone a check or give them $5 to get them off your back. So it's not about the money, I think, as much as the interaction that we can give. Like how can we recognize someone and then it takes a lot of time to build trust, and so a lot of folks that are begging for money, like they're just trying to get what they can, and so it might take a few years to build the trust to where we actually have a relationship that's reciprocal and real, and that's where we want to get. So thanks. Anybody? We're almost done, but back in the back, I've seen you waving at me, and then we'll get it right here and here, and then we'll maybe close.
So I think I can shout this. I could listen to you personally. I could listen to you talk about social justice and restorative justice actions and attitudes all night. But I'm going to challenge myself to ask you a different kind of question. Tell us a little bit about how the Simple Way community worships.
Okay, so the question was about how our community worships, and I guess what I would say is almost everything that we're talking about, I hope, is a part of our worship, right? As Scripture says, true religion is to care for the widow and the orphan in their distress and keep ourselves from being corrupted by the world. So I think that I think very holistically about worship. But one of the things that we found as we started the Simple Way is that the last thing our neighborhood needs is another Sunday morning service. We've got worship services everywhere. And so we very deliberately, one of the things that we've never done is a Sunday worship service. And it's not because we don't believe in that, but because we've got plenty of really wonderful congregations we want to be a part of. So we've always worshiped and become more embedded and ingrained in the fabric of what God's doing in our neighborhood. So I'm grateful for the congregations that we've been a part of over the years. Iglesia del Barrio, Circle of Hope is an Anabaptist Brethren in Christ congregation we're connected to. We do a lot with Circle of Hope. But I've been going to Leslie Callahan's service sometimes at St. Paul's Baptist Church. So there's just a lot of congregations that I think we see God stirring in, and they, renew our souls, and we join them, wherever we can. So that's sort of what worship looks like. And then we've done other things, through the years. We have a book called Common Prayer that we created together to pray together, So common prayer is a big part of my own worship and integrated prayer life. I was laughing because I gave one to the Archbishop after they showed me the table where the Book of Common Prayer was written. I was like, well, here's our version, It was awesome. But anyway, but I think, we're praying with the church around the world. We're praying with the churches in our neighborhood and trying to build, the kingdom of God together. So I think that answers your question, hopefully. And yeah, go ahead, man. Okay, yeah, sure.
I just want to thank you so much. It was good to see you again. I know you spoke at Eastern University. I went and saw the movie Just Mercy, and I watched it, and how do I put this? I think that as an African American, and just seeing the wrongness and the hurting, this country is going down so much, I think. And I guess how do we as a nation, as people, as, I guess, African Americans, I guess, being falsely put in jail under false pretenses? And I guess how do I handle that? Because if I get put over by the cops and all that, and if they see a non-colored person and all that, right? I guess how do, because I've been through a lot of stuff and all that. I guess how do I deal with it? I guess rather than sense, I guess.
So, first of all, thanks for your question. And I think that I have to answer this through a different social location, and I think that part of what we need to realize right now is that all of us are looking at the world through a certain lens that is shaping our reality, and what we've seen out the window, how we've experienced police officers is all different based on that social location. So in East Tennessee, I grew up hearing heroic stories about police officers. My encounters with police officers were all very positive, I moved up to North Philadelphia, and because of my relationships, because of my location in North Philadelphia, my experiences with police officers are very, very different. In fact, some of my scariest encounters in the entire 20 years we've lived in North Philadelphia have involved police officers doing things wrong, having guns pulled on us from police officers, and I'm even light-skinned, right? But having young people in our neighborhood, horrified to the point that our young children shake when they see a police officer because of how scared they are. And we had we tried to do a truth and reconciliation thing where we had some police officers, because we had a friend that was a police officer and some of the young people, and they said, let's talk to each other, So they started the dialogue by asking the kids, what are some of the things that police officers do for us? And the answers that they said as children were, they scare me, they beat down our house, they take my dad. These were the answers. And it was so good that the police officers were there to hear that, because this is what their experience has been, So I think this is a moment where, especially as folks that are, many of us who are white, that have been kind of a part of the dominant structures in our society, we need to realize that our perspective and how we've seen the world is very different from other folks, right? Folks that, that's why, when you ask people, does systemic bias affect our policing and our criminal justice system? In recent studies, white folks overwhelmingly say no. We have a few bad apples, but the system generally works. You ask people of color and they say the exact opposite, almost the mirror opposite, 80%. No, of course systemic justice affects our policing. Look at Ferguson, look at Eric Garner, look at, you got names and stories and personal experiences of that. Even the young people that have come to Eastern from Kensington, their experiences not always been the best with Radnor police walking from the train station to Eastern, right? So that's everywhere. And I think part of what Brian Stevenson and so many others are doing is saying, if we cannot get our future right until we get our past right, our history right, until we realize that hundreds of years of enslaving and racism and Jim Crow, it continues to leave a residue. And until we tell the truth about that, we cannot get the future right. And that's what's happening right now, right? That right now, this is all surfaced, and I think it's very true when people, I often say, Donald Trump did not change America, he revealed America. And the things that are surfacing right now are very, very scary. When people say, make America great again, what many of them are saying is make America white again. Because you think, like, what era of American history do black folks want to relive, right? So there's a very, I think, particular lens of that. And right now, the residue of slavery looks like this, that 1 in 3 African American boys born today can expect to go to prison. 1 in 3. So that is the unreconciled, in East Tennessee, we still have a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest, the founder of the KKK, in the Capitol in East Tennessee, right? Like this, all of this is in every element of society, even the Confederate memorials. You look at that and you go, wow, we are remembering history in a certain way. You don't put up a memorial to September 11th with statues of the terrorists, right? Like, we need to remember those who have suffered from that history. And if we're going to find the future right, we've got to really tell the truth about our past. And that's why I'm so grateful for, the work of Brian Stevenson and so many other folks. If we're, even as white folks, what are you reading right now? How many of the books on our shelves were written by white folks, white theologians? And can we lean into the other voices, right? Can we read the Michelle Alexanders and the other voices out there that are telling theology and sociology from a different perspective? So I think that's part of what's happening with the Black Lives Matter movement, is it's naming something for us. That if we can't say Black Lives Matter, then do we really believe that all lives matter, right? Like, to say, like, Black Lives Matter doesn't mean white lives don't matter. To say black is beautiful doesn't mean white folks are ugly, but it's actually naming and emphasizing what our entire history has neglected. So that's why these movements, I think, are so important. And as white folks, I think we also need to practice being a minority more often. We need to put ourselves in places where, as white folks, we are a minority. It won't be long before we are, so we might as well practice at it, right? But we should be in places where we are being led by people of color. We're joining organizations and supporting organizations that are led by women and men of particularly, Black, Latino, Asian, other, like, Native American leaders. So I think that's a great, place to land. So thanks for your heart. Thanks for all of you for listening, and we'll be praying for you, and as you think of us in Kensington, we're hoping to be a school of love too, and hoping to really show what that looks like in our neighborhood. So I like how Tony always says, at the end of the day, all of us are going to be gathered before God, according to Jesus in Matthew 25, and those red letters, it's not just going to be a doctrinal test that we're given, but according to Matthew 25, it's not that God's going to go, okay, virgin birth, agree, disagree, or strongly disagree, like maybe we wish it was, because that'd be easy, we pass a doctrinal test, but actually we're going to be asked, when I was in prison, did you come visit me? When I was sick, did you take care of me? When I was hungry, did you feed me? That the real measure of our faith is how it works itself out in love and compassion to the most vulnerable people. And so maybe Gandhi was right when they said, if you want to know who the Christians are, you ask the poor, and they will tell you. So may it be so of us. Thanks so much for having me. And I'll be hanging out at the book table. I'm going to meet all